and welcome to another episode of Why Not Us, a college football preview show. I'm Parker Fleming, the VP of Football Strategy at Dropback. You might know me as Stats of War on Twitter. And today we're continuing our series looking at some of the top teams going into 2026 and asking, why not us? What do these teams need to do to accomplish their goals for the season? To do that, we're going to look at Texas today, the Longhorns. And I've got Eric Henry of 247 Sports on with me. Eric, it's great to talk to you for the first time. I'm very excited about this conversation. How are you, man?
No, I'm doing well. Appreciate it, Parker. I'm here in Florida, out of Texas. I'm here in Florida in preparation of SEC Media Days, but always it's talking season, so it's about that time to talk a little Longhorns football.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you getting this in before Media Days. I think I was reaching out to schedule after Media Days, and you were like, let's let it roll. So I love that you're ready to go and can do it. So let's talk a little bit about the Longhorns. Last season, perhaps one of the biggest mismatches of hype and final results I think that we've seen through no fault of Texas's certainly, but I think even people inside the building at Texas would agree that the Arch Manning stuff got a little crazy last summer and put undue burden on him. A team that ended up in some of the advanced metrics as a top 20-ish team. I felt like they had an immense and very promising ceiling, and their issue was just that they couldn't play consistently. That stretch of Florida, Mississippi State, Kentucky feels like the defining feature of, why not us last year? It was those three games. Texas couldn't separate and ended up stumbling against Florida. Internally in the building, how are they approaching spring knowing that they feel like they underperformed a little bit last year?
Yeah, no, listen, you kind of said it a little bit in jest, saying that even they inside the building would admit that expectations got out of hand. No, Parker, they'll be the first to tell us that expectations were out of hand. And they very often remind us that they feel that, in terms of going into last season, not just with Arch Manning, but replacing starters on the offensive line, trying to work in new pieces at wide receiver, working new pieces on defense, that things may have gotten a little bit out of hand. So you kind of spin it forward to 2026 and you ask, how are they handling it? I honestly think, truth be told, and the benefit of hindsight is always 2020, but truth be told, I think going through 2025 was the best thing for this program in that they got to walk a full season and what it's going to be like with Arch Manning as your starting quarterback. And again, you hate to place it all on Arch, but I can sit here and tell you unequivocally right now, in my 4 seasons of covering Texas, even with Quinn Ewers at quarterback and the team being top 5, top 3, things never were as intense as far as the daily scrutiny from national folks, of course, locally, statewide, etc., as they were last year. So I think just the biggest thing for them is just having walked through those trials and tribulations. They have a better idea of what to expect and maybe how to kind of navigate not just, the Arch experience, but really everyone else's experience. Because I'll pass it back to you on this. The thing that one of the things I'm keeping my eye on is, yes, this is a much improved team last year, but you also have, let's just call it a third of the roster and probably a little bit more than that, of guys who are newcomers, who it's going to be their first walk living this scrutiny week in and week out. And in addition to this challenging schedule, it's going to be something to keep an eye on.
That does feel like the fundamental tension in college football right now. It's such a developmental game. Reps matter and consistency matter and chemistry matter. But now you have this opportunity to what I believe. I don't believe Texas thinks they lost pieces as much as they churned the roster and improved at positions and got better and addressed needs. And there's still that tension of, great, we got better. We only have one spring to kind of get these guys to click, and then we've got to roll. We'll talk about the schedule and how it breaks a little bit better this season for them to get rolling and get that consistency. But I think a great segue there to talk about Arch. I do want to plug, I said this off air, you did a great job with Bud Elliott, our friend over on Summer School. I don't want to rehash that or do the exact same thing. So I want to push people to that. I do want to ask you specifically about Arch. He got better throughout the season. And that's what you want to see on him. What is he doing in 2026? What is the hope for him to kind of take that next level and ascend?
Yeah, I'll kind of break it down to a couple things, right? So for those who don't, know, and it's funny, the conversation around Arch, so much of it, in my opinion, Parker, is people reading the box score and then kind of making their judgment off of that. If you haven't watched a ton of Arch Manning football, here's what I'll give you. He has been one of the better deep ball throwers in the nation, not just last year, but even dating back to the 2 starts he made as a redshirt freshman, one against Mississippi State, the other against Louisiana Monroe, and then, of course, coming in halfway the UTSA game. because of that, I think that was an emphasis for Steve Sarkisian last year. If you remember, with Quinn Ewers, Quinn was not a great deep ball thrower. For whatever reason, whether it was with Xavier Worthy, A.D. Mitchell, Matt Golden, etc., there was a lot of underneath, a lot of quick game, and let your receivers kind of do their thing yards after catch. With Arch last year, Steve, the intention, Parker, going into the season was, hey, we're going to push the ball downfield because that's a strength. But then also, I think that kind of became, because we're living, behind the chains down and distance-wise, well, we have to go downfield. To spin it forward to 2026, if Arch Manning is going to take the next step in his game, it's really going to be Steve Sarkisian's offense as a whole kind of melding what they did in 2026 with what worked well in 2024 and what they did well in 2025, than what they did well in 2024 and 2023 with Quinn Ewers, which is complete those shallow and intermediate passes. Those passes that are, between, 1 and 9 yards, if you look at kind of your route tree, those underneath passes. Also your running backs, getting them involved. That was an area where, whether it was going back to Bijan Robinson, Jonathan Brooks, Jaden Blue, let those guys take some of the pressure off you so you're not living behind the chains down in distance. Because there's no reason in my mind that a quarterback in Steve Sarkisian's offense can't complete high 60s to 70% of your passes. Arch Manning was not there last year. If my memory serves me correct, he was at 59 and change, I think, somewhere around there. So that's it, to my mind, is the next step in Arch's game.
And that is something they specifically went to address with two notable transfers in Cam Coleman and in Hollywood Smothers. I think, if we're looking at where the offense struggled, all of that stuff is tied together. That's a really great point. The run defense, or the run offense, 55th in EPA per rush, just wasn't good enough. And then it became, we have to go downfield. There were some painful drops as well. Not to blame necessarily players, but there's some clips as well where you think, oh, they left a lot on the table. And one thing that has kind of unfortunately become a defining feature of the Sarkisian offense over the last couple of years is a struggle to finish drives. Last season they were 48th in quality drive rate, one of my stats, and 67th in finishing. Seasons before that kind of mismatch has been there. They've been a poor finishing team, and I think in addition to getting both of those guys involved in early downs, Texas might have gone above and beyond in terms of budget and market numbers to get Cam Coleman and Hollywood Smothers to try to address specifically that finishing drives problem. Look at the Ohio State game last year. First and goal at the 9, first and 10 at the 16 on 2 separate drives. You lose that game right there. Just a great example of, hey, we need a playmaker who we can 100% count on when the field gets tight. And I think that's exactly what those two guys were brought in to do.
It's interesting, Parker, that you mentioned Cam Coleman and Hollywood Smothers, right? I think if you ask Texas fans, one of the things they're curious about is, hey, who's going to be that guy, as you mentioned, when we get in the red zone, in terms of the run game, who we're going to give the ball to. So I'll kind of, put Hollywood on hold for a second. I think Cam Coleman, as a guy who can just win his one-on-one matchup when the windows get tight, that is no doubt an excellent option. Also, you talk about the drops. Ryan Wingo, I think most Texas media, people in the Texas media market would tell you we're hard on Wingo last year with the drops. It was revealed he had a wrist injury. To what extent that hampered him with the drops, we'll see. But for those who aren't familiar with what Parker says as far as Texas' struggles, this isn't just a one-year blip. This is really the Sarkisian era in Texas as far as struggling to finish drives, right? I've been of the belief that part of their struggle is having no identity. Right? At least commit to doing something. I'll quickly tell this story, Parker, and then come back to kind of what you said with Cam and Hollywood Smothers. If there's one sequence I would say is indicative of the Steve Sarkisian era in the red zone, you go back to 2023's Red River shootout against Oklahoma in the Cotton Bowl. They get down there, 4 tries from inside the 2-yard line. They go 3 runs. Now, mind you, on 2 of those runs, they bring in Byron Murphy and Tavondre Sweat as lead blockers, right? Those plays get blown up, and then they try, on 4th down to try a little quick pass to Xavier Worthy. That gets blown up, right? I think it's going to be imperative for this offense, whatever it is they're going to do. If it's, hey, Cam, go win your one-on-one matchup. Okay, at least commit to that from spring through fall, and this is what we're going to do. Or if it's Hollywood Smothers, who, both he and Raleek Brown, not necessarily the biggest backs in the world, but they have a pronounced ability, a pronounced history of making guys miss. Something that, to your point, Parker, when you talk about the struggles in the run game, Quintravion Wisener, C.J. Baxter struggled. And I love both those guys, great guys to cover. They did not force a lot of missed tackles. So whether it's Smothers or Brown or Cam Coleman, if they can just develop an identity, I think that's going to help Texas well, and not having to settle for threes and end drives with sevens.
Yes, and we know in terms of, I'm a nerd, so I'm always filtering through analytical lens, that stuff like the elusivity and the missed tackles, that's the stuff that's replicable year over year and less situation dependent. Texas last season, bottom quintile in yards before contact and in yards after contact. You've got to improve both of those, which will transition us to the offensive line. I love segues, and something you said made me think of something else. So let's run on a rabbit hole before we come back to the offensive line. I do wonder, I just read Michael Silver's The Why is Everything, which is about Shanahan and McVay and all those guys, Mike McDaniel, Raheem Morris kind of coming up and getting to the NFL. And there is almost this portrait of the offensive mastermind who can't help but overthink because you can do so many things. And that might sound backhanded, and I assure you it's not. But looking at Sarkisian in the red zone, you think, man, maybe some simplicity would go a long way. That's a thought I've had, and your thought about identity there, I think, is totally true. You can do anything in the playbook when it goes to the red zone. Hopefully with these investment in personnel and with Arch maturing, the value proposition for Texas is we know what we're good at and we can go to that consistently. We don't have to sort through this menu of 60 possible plays in the red zone. We know we're going to get Cam the ball, and if that doesn't work, we're going to get some action with the running backs and try to make that work as well.
And that's the reason why I mentioned having an identity. Listen, Steve Sarkisian will have forgotten more about offense than I'll ever know. I'm just a guy who's ceiling max out at Division II football for a year. All right, so let's state that first and foremost.
Hey, D3 almost champion here. So yeah, I understand.
There we go. Right, but Parker, to your point, there is validity in. Steve will never come out and say, hey, paralysis by analysis, right? And kind of that sense in terms of having a Cheesecake Factory menu worth of plays you can run down in the red zone. However, I do think, and you mentioned some of the greatest, offensive minds in history of the game, right? When you're as talented a play caller as Steve Sarkisian, I don't think it's out of bounds to speculate. I would love to get an answer for him. Steve just won't answer that question. He usually be a little bit defensive or defiant. But I would love to get an answer as to whether, truthfully, inside of Steve Sarkisian's head, if it's, hey, when he does his self-assessment at the end of each season, maybe I was doing too much. It's hard to assess that, Parker, because, as I mentioned, it's not a one-year blip. Right? If it's one year, like, hey, all right, we scale things back. But Texas has struggled since my entire time. This is my fourth year covering the team. They've struggled in the red zone. So you do kind of wonder kind of the validity in Steve being such a talented play caller and just having kind of this, buffet of options at what he can do to try to, find 7 points.
Absolutely. And yeah, that's a good, I always feel I'm sitting here wearing my glasses, nerd online. I never want to lob grenades in from outside, and more so just talk about, why is that happening? So those are good words there. The last thing, I'm having to stop myself from saying the biggest question mark on this offense is the offensive line, because I think that's just true for everybody in college football, especially with the mobility here. But talk to me about this offensive line. I mentioned the yards before contact stat, which is loosely a way to judge kind of the offensive line, and getting that run game going to take some pressure off of Arch and give you a little more versatility there. How does this offensive line unit kind of look going into the season?
I think offensive line is my number one question mark. I'm sure we'll touch on special teams a little bit, but that'd be my number two question mark. With offensive line, the hope is that it's improved, right? And listen, when you have an All-American like Trevor Gooseby, that's a hell of a starting block, right? A hell of a building block. So you've got that. But let's just go left to right. The hope is that Lawrence Seymour, the Western Kentucky transfer, for those who don't know, a guy who started his career at Miami, went to Akron and then had to petition for an additional year, was a first-team All-Conference USA guy at Western Kentucky. But I can speak as someone who covered Conference USA for 5.5 years before I got to Texas. There's a big difference between playing games on Saturdays at Hutchins-Smith Stadium in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and playing in the spotlight game every single day, every single Saturday at Texas. I think Seymour is a guy who, from a talent perspective, it's there, but it's going to be interesting to see. He's going to get to campus fall. Can he make up ground and kind of adjust quick in Kyle Flood's system? Connor Robertson at center is a guy who, was a reserve for the majority of his career. Parker, even last year, didn't start the year at center. They went with Cole Hudson at center and kind of went with some younger guys at the guards. Eventually they realized, hey, the best offensive line unit might be the most veteran. Let's just kind of get our most veteran guys out there. Nick Brooks, no longer with the program, who was at left guard and right guard. Connor Stroh, no longer with the program. They moved Cole Hudson over to left guard. Connor Robertson, a veteran at center, comes in, stabilizes things a little bit. But Connor was never necessarily the kind of heir apparent at center, right? As far as being that full-time guy. He was kind of a utility guy. Now he's back with the program. Right guard, you move Brandon Baker inside. I am optimistic that will work. Brandon's a guy who, I mean, just from a measurables perspective, right, has all the physical tools and probably projects better as more of a road grader at right guard. And they bring Melvin Ciani, the right tackle from Wake Forest. Again, someone I'm optimistic on, but, began his career at Temple. And I just think it's the same thing, Parker. How do you adjust from playing in relative anonymity at Temple at Wake Forest to coming to Texas? And you're going to be facing, not only more premier talent, but the attention week in, day out. How do you kind of recover from that?
Baker is interesting to me too. I think 5-10 years ago, there was a little bit more shame in a guy moving inside. And I say shame loosely there, but we talked about Notre Dame on the last episode, and you look at Anthony Knapp, who I watched a bunch of, same thing with Baker, and said, hey, this is a really good lineman. I don't think he's a tackle, dude. So I'm excited to see that there's some more flexibility and willingness to say, hey, you're very talented. Go here. Also, look at the NFL guard market right now. Like, you're not leaving a lot of money on the table by moving in there. So, an interesting unit. I think, we could say the same thing about every team in college football, that the offense is going to go as long as the O-line is healthy and they find the right unit. Some interesting pieces. Ciani from Wake Forest. Wake Forest had a couple dogs transfer out. Jake Dicker identifying some talent over there. Very, very interesting as well. Want to get to the defensive side, looking at time and realizing we could go for 2 hours with what we're doing here, but want to move through, give you an opportunity. I had no questions written down about special teams, but I saw right before this, you tweeted about it and you brought it up there. So talk to me a little bit about Texas special teams, what they need to do to raise the ceiling, to find those hidden yards, to stay in favorable situations.
Yeah, and Parker, by all means, sometimes I can get a little name heavy. So if we got to work the clock, just let me know.
No, I love it. I love it. This is, my notebook is full right now. This is amazing. Yeah.
In terms of special teams, here's kind of, the quick and dirty of it, right? Ryan Niblett was the best return man in the nation, no doubt about that. The kicking game was steady last year. They weren't necessarily as reliant on it as they were in previous years. The rest of teams was bad. Texas was flagged 14 times on special teams, even though, half those penalties weren't accepted. Those infractions still, play a factor in flipping the field and some of those little things you want to do on special teams. In terms of coverage, Texas was 75th in punt return coverage. They were 75th in punt return coverage, 71st in kick return coverage, and they were 121st in kick return yards. So there is a lot of room for improvement. And the reason you spotlight it, you say, hey, all right, 75th, 133 FBS teams, not that bad. Jeff Banks is the number 3 highest paid special teams coach in the nation. Okay, so he's getting paid, compensated like a guy who was not to put forth average results. So that's something to keep an eye on, no doubt.
All right, hard question here. Again, I'm all about segues here. Yeah. Do you think that the special team suffering is a new variable that is a consequence of roster turnover? And I ask that because historically, your young guys earn their spot on the field by playing special teams, and there's a little bit more hunger and a little bit clear path of put effort in and get effort out. Do you think that the transfer portal and kind of the importing of the top of the roster potentially has some trickle-down effects on special teams that aren't impossible to navigate, but are a new variable that teams are having to navigate? And could Texas be suffering from that?
Parker, undoubtedly. I know it was kind of a bit of a fastball question, but that's an easy one.
Yeah.
And I go back to my time covering Group of Fives. When I would talk to those coaches, they would say, man, of course, one of the challenging things is when you lose, kind of your top end guys, right? It's like, who are you going to replace them with? And then it's like, okay, the trickle-down effect is maybe we had I'll just throw out an example, a 2-star freshman who we were hoping is more of a developmental guy. Well, now we've got to put him on teams, and he's not ready for that action either. It's the same concept at Texas. I had a special teams coach, a while back tell me that, no one goes to college to be, the L4 on kick return, right, or kickoff duty, right? They all think they're going to be the starter and this, that, and the other. So, yes, when you have I'll give you an example. A guy like Bo Barnes, who was a linebacker at Texas, transferred to Kentucky. That was a guy who excelled on special teams. And you would hope if you'd be able to bring him back this year, right, that he not only could play somewhere in the rotation, but could build on his ability on special teams. Well, now that's gone, and now you're trying to teach a whole new group of guys that. So undoubtedly, that's a factor.
Makes a lot of sense. Again, I'm a huge roster building nerd, and just thinking about those those areas to strategize. Let's flip over to the defense, a unit that I think should be very exciting this year, despite losing Anthony Hill and some guys on the back end. One of my big offseason projects is I have a couple scout friends, and we just debated Colin Simmons versus Dylan Stewart. And a couple of them had Colin Simmons over Dylan Stewart, and my prior on that was like, no way. But I went through and kind of watched both of them. You look at some of the numbers, and Simmons' versatility is one of the most impressive things in college football right now. The way that he can line up in different positions, the way he can win with different moves. I think Texas has a truly special player in Simmons. So want to give you the opportunity to kind of talk about him and the leap that he is looking to make this year as one of the best players in college football. And then who is kind of the counterpunch? Who's going to be around him?
Yeah, it's you always kind of, as a beat writer, you kind of hate those discussions of like 1 versus 2 because, in all honesty, you cover one guy, right? So inherently there's a bias. However, it's hard for me to see another pass rusher, another edge as gifted as Colin Simmons. I mean, Colin, as you mentioned, does all of those things. Let me just throw this out at you. I'm sure you may know this, your broader audience may not. Colin is a guy who, through the first 5 games of last year, had more penalties than he did sacks. He had 5 penalties, 1.5 sacks, 1.5 tackles for loss, and still managed to lead the SEC in sacks and was second in tackles for loss at the end of the year. The first step, and I don't know if that's what jumps out to you, but that's what stood out to me just year 1, right, is, man, true freshman, he might have a top 5, top 10 first step, pass rushing in college football. His ability to build and add versatility to his game, all the while, Parker, pressing, self-admittedly, the first 5, 6, 7 games of last year is incredible to me. So I genuinely think, especially in Will Muschamp's scheme, Colin is someone who has a chance to take an even greater leap. And it would be hard-pressed for me. Again, I see the guy every day, so I'm biased, but it'd be hard-pressed for me to see him not being a top 5 pick in next year's NFL draft.
And with the body type, I think there's opportunities for growth and coverage. He dropped back a decent amount. And again, this is nerd sitting behind my computer. His head was he was looking around trying to get a feel for it. And he doesn't have that prototypical edge body. He's got a little bit more versatility. I think there's a lot of money to be made in him showing a little bit more coverage and field feel when he is in pass coverage too there, which is, again, scary for a guy who can win in the pass rush so consistently and in so many ways. Bring in Rasheem Biles from Pitt, who's another intriguing weapon. Obviously not going to be 1-for-1 replacing Anthony Hill because that's not how replacing NFL talent works, but a very interesting player. How does he plug in this linebacker unit?
For anyone not familiar with Rasheem Biles, is actually the
Raheem. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, Raheem's mother corrected us. Just turn on the tape at the Military Bowl. I mean, you see his ability to play behind the opposing teams or in the opposing team's backfield just in that game. I think the thing about him, again, looking at him in Will Muschamp's system, and also I think lined up next to Ty Anthony Smith, it's going to allow Raheem to do some of those things as far as rushing the passer, as far as kind of, being a bit of a playmaker. And it's interesting you talk about him not being a 1-for-1 replacement, Anthony Hill. I think, this is interesting because the numbers don't necessarily show this, Parker. But if you ask most Texas fans, I think they would say that they were disillusioned with the amount that former defensive coordinator Pete Kwiatkowski had Anthony Hill playing in coverage, right? And I think there's merit to that, in that situationally, you probably would have wanted to see Anthony Hill, when it comes to those third and whatever situations, go rush the passer, right? And I think situationally, it may have been more glaring to see, oh man, Anthony Hill drops back in coverage. But even look at the Georgia game when he makes that pick. That's a byproduct of his athleticism. I think Rasheem Biles is someone who has the ability to do that. I think he had 9 pass breakups. I can't remember if it was last year or the year before. So he's got the ability to play in coverage, but I do think genuinely in this system, where you're going to see him kind of excel is being that guy who kind of pins his ears back and rushes the passer and plays in the opposing team's backfield.
Love that, which is very scary. Looks like they, very scary combined with Colin Simmons. Looks like they are once again emphasizing beef along the defensive line. Obviously, have some talent there. They were fourth in EPA per rush allowed last season, so very, very stout unit. They bring in guys like Gaffard from from Arkansas, who didn't have the greatest film, but also you can't coach 6'7", 385. Like you can teach the skills to the frame and do that. So there's the bet with that as well. I expect the run defense to be incredibly stout and perhaps even kind of dictating what teams can do entirely to Texas for this season.
And not just Griffard, but the entire defensive tackle room. But I'll say in kind of specificity with Ian, I think he's going to be a better version of what they wanted Cole Brevard to be last year. I think Ian, size-wise, bigger, but a little more athleticism, a little bigger body. I think the motor, if you take a look at the film, I know that's kind of a cliche word, but it's a little more consistent because that was one of the gripes when he spoke with some people on staff about kind of Cole Brevard, his consistency and his ability to do it, play in, play out when called upon. But that defensive tackle room goes deep. I mean, Hiro Kanu is another guy who's excellent against the run. Alex January, Murad Watson. So yes, and I'd be inclined to agree with you when we were kind of speculating about question marks. I'm not 100% sold on this secondary. I think there are some wait and see, kind of aspects to it. But if there's a reason to buy into the secondary, I think it's because the front seven really as a whole is going to be able to dictate what teams opposing offenses can and can't do.
Absolutely, and not only in terms of run and pass, but again, we know weak link and strong link theory in football, where if the pass rush is really good, that makes it easier on your secondary and vice versa. So going to be set up really, really well. Okay, with a couple minutes we've got left here, I want to ask two questions. One of them is going to be about schedule. First, anyone we haven't talked about that if they jumped off the page and were awesome this year for Texas, you would not be surprised? Who's kind of that off-the-radar player who, if we all know his name in November, you're not surprised at all?
I'm going to stick on the defensive side of the ball, say cornerback Cade Phillips. The guy is, 6 foot, 185 pounds, got 3 starts down the stretch of last year as a true freshman, supplanted a fifth-year senior starter at corner. Just turn on his game film against Arkansas. There's kind of a 3-play stretch. I want to say it's the fourth quarter, if memory serves me correct, where makes a pair of open field stops on Mike Washington, a much bigger guy. That sets up a play where Colin Simmons is able to get a strip sack on I think Taylon Green was still at quarterback at the time, but gets a strip sack on Arkansas's quarterback. Leonga Lafau takes it for a fumble return touchdown. That whole sequence is set up by Cade Phillips' ability to make open field tackles, so keep an eye on him defensively.
Love that. The schedule sets up very, very nicely. You get a nice way to tune up for Ohio State with Texas State, although I'll say Texas State can go. They will try to score some points. It will be a legitimate test for the defense, and you almost want that before going into the Ohio State game. And then kind of a middle of the pack SEC schedule in terms of difficulty. I think everyone in Austin is relieved to not have to play Georgia and get that regular season break, hopefully seeing them in the SEC championship. But there's a little bit of a tricky stretch with that OU Florida Ole Miss back-to-back. I think in looking at last year and thinking about this year, we know Texas has the talent. We know they have the ceiling. What they've been struggling with the last couple of years, and last year in particular, is don't hit your floor. Like, stay above your floor. Where is the trap game? Where is the problematic stretch on this schedule for you? What are they trying to – what games are most problematic?
I kind of point towards the end of the season. I do think the schedule is pretty stiff, but I think just going through the gauntlet, right, because you're going to play Ohio State. If I were to say a quote-unquote trap game, I think going to Tennessee, that's going to be an 11 a.m. kickoff or noon Eastern time. I can't remember where Knoxville is. I think that's Eastern time. Either way, it's an early kickoff, right? That one surprised me because I thought that would have been a night game, but making your first ever trip to Neyland Stadium. But I look at the end of the season, right? You end with LSU. I believe it's Missouri, LSU, A&M. That's going to be tricky, right? And you got to go to A&M this year. I mean, that is A&M's. It's a place, and especially Death Valley, and then going to Kyle Field. It's going to be kind of. I think it's going to test how they can finish, right? Because that's one of the things that impressed me about the 2024 team is through everything they were able to find. And remember, they go to Kyle Field, go to A&M. If my memory serves me correct, I believe Gooseby had to come in, I want to say 2 or 3 drives into that game for Kelvin Banks Jr. and their ability to finish there, right? That, I think, is going to be the stretch that really could define Texas this season.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think it was much more a meme, a long time. I'm a TCU guy and was always chafed by kind of the SEC gauntlet and the back-to-back. But you look at, how Georgia has fared and how Texas has fared. There are no easy outs in this. Well, Eric, this was amazing as we hit the half-hour mark here. So information dense. Thank you for kind of walking me through Texas 2026. Where can people find you, follow your work online?
No, first off, I've been a huge fan, so I appreciate you having me on.
Awesome.
You can find me on Twitter at @EricCHenry_. You can find all my coverage of Texas football, and I'll plug the basketball coverage as well over at Horns 24/7 on all socials.
Awesome. Love that. Well, Eric, enjoy Media Days, enjoy sunny Florida, and we'll talk again soon.
Awesome. Appreciate it.